This is the third and final video in my video series about taxation. As I've already argued against taxation from a strictly utilitarian and a necessary evil point of view, I'll now address the issue from the standpoint of ethics. Although I haven't talked about them, ethics are far more important than any utilitarian justification for or against taxation. This is because if it can be demonstrated that we as humans have certain rights, then violating these rights would surely constitute an evil action that must be shut down at all costs. Before continuing, I want to quickly mention that a lot of the theory in this video comes from Hoppe's The Economics and Ethics of Private Property, as well as Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty. The first thing I'm going to talk about with regards to rights is the right to self-ownership, or essentially the fact that we all own our bodies and have the exclusive say over how they're used. Although this fact is almost always accepted by people all across the political and economic spectrum, its implications often fall on deaf ears, so rigorously proving its necessity might help clear up any confusions. Firstly, let's define ownership. Ownership is the just right to use anything and control it. If I own something, it implies I justly should get the final say in its use. Ownership, however, is not synonymous with control. To control something implies you can manipulate it and do with it what you please. However, this in itself does not imply that this is justified. To say something is owned by someone is to say that they legally and morally should get the final say in its use. Now that the idea of ownership has been established, let's look at possible cases for ownership of a person. There are 4 potential cases for who owns a person. Scenario A is that no one owns them. Scenario B is that someone else owns them. C is that everyone is collectively owned by everyone. And D, that each person owns himself. Now, given that we are trying to derive the just ethical principle here, and ethics is the study of how humans should conduct themselves, we and everyone else who makes ethical claims to any extent are presupposing that humans exist, and therefore that our derived ethical principles apply to humans. This means that whatever ethic we find must be a human ethic, meaning it must pertain to humans and lead to the continued existence of humans. With this in mind, let's look at these scenarios one by one, starting with A. In scenario A, we claim that no one owns them, or in general, no one owns anyone. This ethic is anti-human on the grounds that its adoption would lead to the immediate conclusion of all action. This is because if I, for example, do not own myself, and no one else does, then in doing any action, I'm altering or changing to some extent property that I do not own. This, however, would be unjust, as I do not have the exclusive right to have a say in how this property is used, meaning my actions here would be unjustifiable. As discussed, if something is found to be unjust, then it is a legal and moral wrong that should be immediately stopped. This then implies that all action among every human should immediately stop, and in doing so would result in the death of every human, meaning this ethic could not possibly be correct, because as we discussed, any ethic we suppose must lead to the continuation of human existence. Now let's look at scenario B, where someone else owns someone, where in general there's a class of people who own another class of people. This is quite obviously slavery, which everyone agrees to be a moral evil. However, this ethic can be farther proved false, as in the creation of an ethical model, we presupposed that the ethic must apply to humans. However, this slavery ethic does no such thing, as it divides humanity into a class of owners and a class of subhumans. Because this ethic does not apply to all humans and is not universal, it can be dismissed as false. Let's look at scenario C now, where it's supposed that everyone collectively owns everyone. This ethic fails on the grounds that it does not lead to the continuation of human life. If it is the case that everyone collectively owns everyone, then before any action can commence, it must be agreed upon which action should take place. Any action that is not agreed to is unjust, as the owners of the person taking this action did not agree for that action to commence. This means that all action which is not agreed upon must immediately stop. However, to agree upon an action is in itself an action, meaning all agreeing upon which action should take place must stop. But again, this agreeing to agree to act is an action. As we can see, this infinitely regresses and leaves us with the conclusion that once again, similar to scenario A, all action together must halt, leading to the immediate death of humanity. So the collective ownership ethic clearly cannot be the case, as it is not a human ethic. This leaves us, by argumentum e contrario, that the only possible ethic left is that of self-ownership. With this conclusion, it's demonstrated that each individual owns themselves and justly has the exclusive right to decide what happens to them. While this isn't particularly revolutionary, as just by simple intuition it seems quite obvious that self-ownership is the obviously correct ethic, it's important to rigorously prove this, as we will use it to come to some unsavory conclusions for the people who subscribe to an ideology which justifies taxation. Now that self-ownership has been ethically justified, let's take a look at law and conflict. Law, in essence, is a subset of ethics. If ethics tells people how generally to act, the role of law is to determine who wins in situations where people disagree on how to act. We will call these instances, quote, conflicts. To specifically define conflicts, they are contradictory actions. This means a conflict arises whenever there are two actors who want to use some given good for two or more contradictory things. Think, for example, Crusoe wanting to use a stick for spearfishing and Friday wanting to use the same stick to stoke a fire. Both of these things obviously cannot commence at the same time, so the role of law is to decide which action should take place and which shouldn't, aka who should be the winner and who should be the loser in any given conflict. Now, the root of conflict is scarcity. Imagine for a moment we are in the Garden of Eden, where there exists no scarcity, and one can summon whatever goods they so choose by will. As there is no scarcity, there can be no conflicts over any of these goods. However, conflicts over the use of one's body and its space it occupies are still possible, so a legal system is still required. As the goal of law is to solve conflict, any legal system that is suggested must subscribe to the idea of conflict avoidance. If anything else were the case, then this legal system would be the very antithesis of what it seeks to accomplish. The only legal system which avoids conflict is that legal system which ascribes illegality to the initiation of conflict. To prove this, let's simply look at the reductio of where all people abide by this legal system. Clearly, if no one initiates any conflict, then there will be no conflict. Any other legal system that allows for some amount of conflict will have more conflict than our legal system based on conflict initiation being illegal. So, if it is the case that conflict initiation is illegal, let's return to the Garden of Eden again. Since conflict initiation is illegal, it implies that anyone who attempts first to use someone else's body in a way contrary to how that person wanted, they are in the wrong, and that the same goes for the space they occupy. The situation is complicated farther when we leave the Garden of Eden and return to the world of scarcity, which we actually live in. Because we live in a world with scarce goods, conflicts over these scarce goods can also arise. So firstly, how does one come into possession of a scarce good? Let's take the case of an unowned good, say a stick on a tree, that no one has made a claim over. Because no one else is using this stick or has ownership of it, no conflict arises in appropriating it for yourself. The original appropriation is called homesteading. Once you've homesteaded a good, you have made an undisputed ownership claim over it. Anyone else who could potentially come in and dispute this ownership claim would, by definition, be starting a conflict over the use of the good and thereby be committing a crime under our natural law system, as they have initiated a conflict. It couldn't be that the second, third, fourth, or any other arbitrary number person to come to the good is the owner, because then ownership and property lose their very purpose and meaning. The existence of property is founded on conflict avoidance, meaning it's a conflict-avoiding norm. If no conflicts could come about because everyone's desires were in harmony with each other, then there would be no need for property or law because there would be no disputes. Property and the concept of ownership exist specifically because these conflicts can arise. If the second comer is the just owner of some property, the only way they could have come into possession of that property, assuming no voluntary agreement had been made, would be by starting a conflict. However, if conflict is necessary for property and ownership, then the very problem they seek to resolve is instantiated, thereby undermining the purpose of their existence, implying a contradiction. By this fact, we come to the conclusion that the original appropriator of some scarce resource has a just property right in that good, and anyone who wishes to start a conflict over said resource is in the wrong legally and morally. It is not the mixing of labor with land that implies property rights as the Lockean view of property would have it. Rather, it's the original appropriation that defines who has a property right. Now that we have defined a system of property and demonstrated that it is the only possible just system of property, we can continue to examine taxation. Taxation is the non-consensual imposition of wealth. Non-consensual is included in the definition of taxation here because consensual donation of wealth is simply charity. I don't think anyone is ignorant enough to think that the entirety of taxation comes simply from charitable and altruistic people trying to uplift their fellow man. Rather, taxation implies a lack of consent in its very nature. With this in mind, then, If there are some just owners of wealth who have come into possession of this wealth through homesteading or contractual voluntary means, then levying a tax on this property is by definition illegal and immoral under our system of natural law, which is again the only just system of property. However, not only is this a sort of immoral, illegal action, it is tantamount to slavery. Let me explain. If we have established that people are all self-owners and have a just claim in their property, then forcing someone to go against this is by definition slavery, as it's imposing an ownership claim over a just owner. This is exactly what slavery is understood to be, the unjust control over one person and their labor. All that taxation does is claim ownership over a certain portion of a just owner's property. The effect this has is essentially creating a class of subhumans, who, according to the tax supporter, do not have the same property rights to their goods as the class of those who do have their rights. By this fact, then, taxation is in its essence equivalent to slavery. The only reason why it's not seen as such is because the state of public opinion has been sufficiently altered to ignore this blatant and almost obvious reality. If it is the case that taxation is slavery, then it must be the case that taxation ought be immediately abolished as it is a moral evil. Note that nowhere in this argument is the idea of utility or, quote, a benefit to society or detriment to society introduced. This is purely based on ethical principles and therefore cannot be denied on any empirical grounds, as that is not the argument. To meaningfully argue against this, one must A, demonstrate that self-ownership is not the case, B, that original appropriation is not the correct system of property assignment, or C, that taxation does not constitute a lack of consent. Both A and B have been addressed with a sufficient amount of rigor, however I haven't made a very in-depth argument for C. This is because there's dozens of arguments for why taxation isn't theft, and while all incorrect, they take a long time to address. Because of this, I'd recommend watching or reading some other content on it, although at some later point I'll probably make a video specifically addressing taxation being theft. With this video then, I've completed my attack on taxation and hopefully convinced you, at least to some extent, that taxation's evil, unnecessary, or at the very least we should reduce it as much as possible. Anyways, thanks for watching this final video in my series about taxation, and like or subscribe would greatly be appreciated, and as always, leave any criticism or questions in the comments.